Welcome to School of Rock Bottom with Oliver Mason. This is a very special episode because today we are going to be looking at the 12 lies of addiction. Now, I know a lot of you that follow the podcast, and I'm so grateful to every single person that is following me on this incredible journey. I know a lot of you are creatives who are really interested in mental health, but I also know there is a large quantity of listeners and viewers that are in recovery from all kinds of mental health conditions, probably with a slight leaning to addiction. So this is a little early Christmas present for you guys. I thought I'd do a special. I've got no guests today, which feels really weird. I'm basically on my own, which feels very strange indeed. And I wanted to do a special episode for those people and maybe loved ones and family members of those people that are trying to stay away from a drink or a drug a day at a time. And of course, through this festive period, it's incredibly challenging. So anything I can do to help, I most certainly will. I've been in recovery myself for many years, and I know that the early months and even years can be incredibly difficult. And for those of you that are new to the channel or new to the podcast, so my name is Oliver Mason. I'm an actor, I'm a voiceover artist, I'm a mental health coach, I'm a performing arts school principal, a podcaster, but I also know firsthand that rock bottom can be the greatest teacher and a springboard for a beautiful life. And it's all these careers and life experiences and passions all combining that have given birth to this podcast. So if you're listening or watching this on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button. If you're on Spotify, please hit follow. And if you're on Apple, please also hit follow and leave a review. Okay, that's a little pitch out of the way. Let's get straight into it. So I'm calling this the 12 lies of addiction. Now, I'm fully aware that there's more, but these are kind of the basic ones, the ones that really come at people full force, particularly in early recovery, but they can linger on and on and on. So I'm going to start this off really by asking the question, what is addiction? Now, if you got a scientist in the studio with me now, a lecturer, a professor, you could get lots of different people that will have a different view on what addiction is. What I'm not going to do today on this podcast is kind of give you a kind of scientific point of view of what addiction is. What I'm going to give you is what I think is useful for somebody, and maybe even a family member or a loved one of somebody that's actually in recovery themselves, the best tools that they can have in order to fight this thing called addiction. Because in early recovery in particular, it does feel like a fight. I call addiction something very, very simple. I use this for myself, and I also use it with clients that I work with in rehabs and other places. I quite simply call addiction the liar. We've got a little voice in our head that's telling us porcupines. It likes to lie to us and tell us that regardless of all the evidence that drinking and drugging is a terrible idea, it comes up with a lie that's trying to convince you otherwise. And I want you to think about that for a minute. I want you to think of just one consequence that drinking or drugging has brought into your life. And then think to yourself, if that was the consequence of a banana, would you ever eat another banana? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't need Banana Anonymous. You wouldn't need a banana rehab. You wouldn't be going to dinner parties, seeing people eating bananas and going, "No, you should ban bananas, ban the bananas." You just would never eat another banana. So if you think about those consequences that have come to your door because of addiction, what incredible bullshit has addiction got to come up with so that you would ever go back? And so this is why I call it the liar. And before you sort of, start feeling really bad about your situation, I think most human beings have a liar in their head. Over the years, it's been called different things. It's been called inner critic or doubting Thomas or imposter syndrome. There's a lot of science around that, about why human beings evolved with imposter syndrome. And there's good reason for it. It is actually linked to survival. Check out the work of Professor Stephen Peters. He goes into a lot of detail about that. I'll put a little link in the show notes about that. But Actually, imposter syndrome is something that is actually built within us to help us to survive. And I think addiction is similar, but its whole angle is, what rubbish have I got to come up with to convince you, the person suffering with addiction, that addiction is a good idea again, despite all of these horrific consequences? So, really, addiction is being mugged off on a massive scale. So, what we're going to do now is we're going to break down the 12 basic lies of addiction. So, let's start with lie one. Lie one is, there is no problem. I don't exist. I mean, this is a real genius move by addiction here. It just pretends it's not there. And denial kills people. You know, it literally kills people. For those that are listening to this, that are on this recovery journey, or maybe you're listening to this for a loved one, or maybe you're just kind of curious about your own situation, you know, this moment where you get a moment of clarity that there is a problem, don't take it for granted. It might not come again. It does kill people. People literally die in denial. And so addiction just denies the problem exists, which is incredible when you think about the consequences that actually addiction brings to the door. And often we're the last people to know, you know. And I think there's different stages of denial as well. I think there's the kind of first stage of denial where you're just like, your jaw's on the floor, you know, and someone says, you know, I think you might have a drink problem. And it's like saying, why don't you go to a support group up the road for people with no heads? Do you know what I mean? It's like, what are you talking about? This is ridiculous. And then usually that then goes into another stage of denial, which is something like, you're sort of aware that there's an issue, and when people sort of bring it up, you get a little bit cross, or you just sort of brush it to one side. Then the next level seems to be around, you know, when people bring it up, it's like, don't you dare talk about my very destructive drinking or drug taking or whatever it is. And then there's the kind of the fourth stage, I think, which is wanting to want to stop. So, you know, you're not quite there. You're not really wanting to stop, but you're wanting to want to stop. And that's kind of another kind of weird phase of denial that isn't really talked about very much. Now, I'm hoping that if you're listening to this podcast today, that actually you're coming out of denial, or you're sort of in the process of learning about denial. I'm quite lucky with the work that I do in rehabs, because this isn't a lie that I have to sort of do a lot of work with, because they're in a rehab. But you'd be surprised, people in rehab are still sort of can sit there and go, oh, maybe I've made a terrible mistake, you know, maybe I should have spent this money on going to the Bahamas or something like this. So, you know, it can linger and it can come back. But lie one essentially is, there is no problem. All right, let's get on to lie two. This one is almost the same thing, and most people get stuck on this one. So lie two is, there is a problem, but the problem won't go away. So addiction goes from basically saying, I don't exist, to I do exist, and you're screwed. I'm not going to leave you alone. I don't know where that voice came from. You know, some people sort of feel like in recovery, you know, they might get to 3 months actually, and they might be feeling, you know, really, really, really good. They might be about to go and meet a friend for a coffee, and they're about to go and put their shirt on, and they look in the back of the wardrobe, and there's addiction kind of at the back going, morning, how are you? And the person's like, but hang on a minute, I'm 3 months without a drink or a drug. What are you doing here? Oh, didn't I tell you? I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to haunt you for the rest of your life. And so most people don't even try recovery, because they think, well, what's the point? What's the point if every single day I'm going to be fighting this thing called addiction? So it's a really clever lie, because if you believe it won't go away, if you believe the problem won't go away, then recovery basically becomes pointless. But again, it's a lie. It does go away. I would argue strongly that if you just do recovery on willpower, it won't go away, because what you're actually doing is you're fighting addiction every single day. And we know that for most people, willpower just isn't a strategy that you want to go down. I mean, try using willpower when you've got chronic diarrhea. It's probably, you know, you might be the toughest person in the world, but at some point you're going to pull your pants. So, willpower, it will just be a matter of time before, the wheels come off on that one. But the problem does go away. It's just that it doesn't go away in the way you want it to. You see, the way I wanted it to go away was I wanted addiction to be kind of Top Boy styley, taken down an alleyway, gun to the head chopped off, bosh, into the River Thames. Do you know what I mean? Done, never to be seen again. And that isn't what happens. Uh, what actually happens is, and this is dependent on what your recovery looks like. If you are connected to your recovery through therapy, smart recovery, AA, NA, CA, sponsor, steps. If you've got a recovery program and you're staying away from that first drug or that first drink, then it most certainly gets arrested. It gets put in a high security prison. It gets life. It gets moved to Europe. And then eventually it gets life in Australia in a prison. But occasionally it does get hold of a burner phone, because apparently you can get hold of those in prison, and it will drop you a text. But for most people in recovery that have a strong program, they stay connected, and obviously they stay away from that first drug or that first drink. It can feel as mildly irritating. Like every 2 weeks, I get a text from Domino's, and it says, 2 pizzas. Pizzas for the price of one, and I hit stop, and every couple of weeks I still get the same text. It's mildly irritating, but it's not like the end of the world. So addiction doesn't fully go away. It doesn't die, although that's another lie that it tells you later on. It tells you that it is dead, and actually, you don't have a problem anymore. So weirdly, I'm very grateful now when I get a little thought in my head that, maybe a drink is a good idea again. Because I've experienced it playing dead on me, and I'll come to that a little bit later. But yeah, essentially, it does go away, but it doesn't go away completely. But the journey that you're about to go on, where you probably feel like you've got 10 monkeys on your back, which is what it feels like in the early days, it's nothing like that further down the track. And again, it's all dependent on what you do next, and how committed to your recovery you are, what that journey will look like. And that's probably another whole podcast in itself. If you're interested about more than that, drop me some messages in the comments, and I'll be happy to talk to whoever wants to talk to me about that. Life 3. Here we go. Life 3 is addiction says, me and you are one. Oh, I love this one. This is brilliant, right? So it goes from I don't exist to I do exist and I'm never going to leave you alone to me and you are the same thing. I mean, talk about doing a complete 360. That's completely insane if you think about it. And it's really of no surprise, really. And this is why recovery is so tricky, because early on, people are doing things like maybe a step 1 where they're having to be really honest about their drinking or drug taking. They might even be going into meetings and saying words like, I'm an alcoholic or I'm an addict. And, I would argue that's probably quite important, because that reminds the person that if they take one drink or one drug, that they will become powerless to that drink or drug. So I think it's quite important for anyone on that journey to make that connection. But then what addiction does is it kind of hijacks that, and it makes it your whole identity. You and your addiction are not the same thing. It's part of you. It's part of who you are. But that doesn't mean it's the same thing. I mean, I've got a finger. I can see it right here. It's part of who I am. It's clearly on my arm. But that doesn't mean that's who I am. In fact, I could chop my finger off and I'm still me. So something can be part of you without it being you. But of course, addiction will tell you otherwise. And that's really clever, because if you are addiction, then you're definitely going to relapse. You're definitely going to drink. You're definitely going to use. So a really important thing to do is to separate yourself from your addiction. So I call it the liar. You might decide to call it something else. You can be as fruity with the wording as you like. But never give addiction that power. Never say, I feel like a drink today. I feel like a drug today. Say, oh, the liar wants a drink or a drug today. The bit of you that's really you doesn't want to drink and doesn't want to use, but yet you've got this little voice in your head that is telling you otherwise. So separate those two things. This now brings me on to lie 4, which is addiction is too complicated to understand. Well, this is pretty clever of addiction, isn't it? Because if it is too complicated to understand, then we haven't really got a chance. And actually, if you go on the internet or read a book on addiction, you're going to feel more and more powerless and like you haven't got a chance. And it just seems so confusing. So I'm going to counter that and say that addiction is very simple to understand. And I'm not saying that to minimize your situation. I'm actually saying that to empower you, because if you can understand some simple nuts and bolts of what addiction is, that's going to make you feel really good about going forward. And maybe more importantly, understand why you've been behaving in the way that you've been behaving. Now, the reasons why people get addicted and why people use drugs and alcohol to self-medicate is not simple. It's often very complicated. It could be because of PTSD or trauma or childhood abuse or anxiety or depression. Those things are complicated. But in terms of what happens to the brain, during addiction, I would counter and say it is quite simple. And actually, I'm just going to focus on 2 parts of the brain. And I really encourage anyone who's in recovery, particularly early on, to keep the science around addiction super simple, okay? Because addiction doesn't like it when we keep it simple, because we can just cut right through its bullshit, all right? So the one part of the brain that I'm going to focus on with addiction to start with, in fact, I'm only going to talk about 2 and a third later, is first of all, the amygdala. So the amygdala is the oldest part of our brain. It's slap bang right in the center. There's actually 2 little amygdalae, and it's Greek for almond because it's almond shaped, and it's got 2 jobs. One is it's our survival center. So it's scanning for danger, and it will activate our fight or flight response, and it will prepare our body to either fight something or run away. This was really, really useful when we were like cave people or something, and there was bears and lions and tigers or dinosaurs or whatever coming for us. Not dinosaurs. So it's our fight or flight response, and it's all built around keeping us alive. The other part of the amygdala is it stores our emotional memories. So other bits of the brain like the hippocampus and the neocortex, that will store other memories, but our emotional ones, that's the job of the amygdala. So yeah, I find that quite funny, really. It's like the amygdala's got 2 jobs. It's like, yeah, keep you alive and store emotional memories. Kind of a bit random, but that's what it does. So if you're feeling really anxious and someone gives you a glass of wine and that anxiety goes away and you feel better, the amygdala remembers that, and it remembers that it's worked. If you're feeling really, really depressed and you snort some cocaine, and even for a second your depression seems to lift, the amygdala remembers that works. And then it becomes logical for those people to think, okay, well, where does my next drink come from? Or where does my next drug come from? That person isn't just getting the dopamine release from the alcohol or the drug, but it's also getting the removal of the emotional or mental problem that was already there. You're getting the removal of anxiety plus the hit of alcohol. You're getting the removal of depression, so it seems, plus the hit of dopamine from the cocaine. So it's sort of like a double whammy. And what the amygdala does is it takes a snapshot of that and it remembers that it worked. And the amygdala is so powerful. It has the ability to usurp the prefrontal cortex, which is, this part of the brain, which is essentially us that plans and makes decisions. I mean, a really good example of that is, imagine you're walking down the street on holiday and a snake jumps out of the bush. You immediately just run. You just get out of there. You don't sort of engage with your prefrontal cortex and go, oh, this is very interesting, isn't it? Oh, there seems to be a snake. Oh dear, it seems to have bitten me. You're just like, shit, there's a snake, and you run away. And then what your brain does is it takes a snapshot of that bush, and the next time you're walking down a similar road, you're like, oh, actually, let's go a different direction, because the last time I went down there was a snake. And of course, if some people have got quite sensitive amygdalae, That could even turn into a phobia of bushes, or some form of panic or PTSD. And for other people, it's not a big thing. So we do know that sensitivity of the amygdala, can play a big role in whether someone is going to, get a substance misuse problem. So a healthy amygdala works alongside the second thing I want to talk about, which is the dopamine reward system. And the dopamine reward system is really useful for survival because every time we come in contact with some stimuli that's going to help us to survive, the dopamine reward system gives us a hit of dopamine, which is obviously a chemical in the brain. That some people call it the pleasure chemical, but it's more of a reward chemical, a reinforcing chemical. A lot of the research on it now is much more around the reinforcing nature of dopamine, because if you do something and you get hit dopamine, guess what? You're going to do it again. And really, at its heart, addiction is a chronic learning disorder. So a healthy dopamine reward system in cahoots with your amygdala is really quite simple. I mean, I look at it a little bit like the Premier League table because I like football and it's simple. So top of the Premier League table in the kind of hierarchy of stimuli for the dopamine reward system is temperature. Our core body temperature cannot move many degrees before we're dead. Have a little Google. It's a bit shocking. So usually it worries about temperature first, and then it moves on to water and hydration. And that's why alcohol is so easy to kind of hijack the dopamine reward system, because the brain can easily think that it's water because it's obviously something that you drink. Third is food, because obviously you can live longer without food. Fourth is sex, because obviously that's part of our hardwiring to reproduce. Fifth is kind of other social interactions, parenting, but other social interactions as well. And then last on that table is anything else that gives us a hit of dopamine. So that could be internet shopping, that could be chocolate, that could be pornography, that could be crack cocaine, that could be alcohol, that could be nicotine. Now, in a healthy dopamine reward system in cahoots with the amygdala, they would be in that order. And of course, cocaine or alcohol would be last. And all that happens, I say all that happens, it's devastating for the person that's suffering this, is what should be bottom of the league against all odds starts to rise up, and it causes havoc in people's lives. And the brain starts to learn that it needs this thing to survive. And that's why some people in recovery, they talk about, going to the off license as if their life depended on it. And it's because literally that part of the brain, the amygdala and the dopamine reward system, it's been hijacked and it believes it needs it to survive. And anybody that has a brain that's working like that, their lives become unmanageable. So this isn't a moral failing. It's not because you're weak. It's not because you're a bad person. It's because you've got a chronic learning disorder that has completely overtaken the brain. But the great news is that with abstinence, this can all return to normal. But with a word of caution, that those neural pathways that have been formed with addiction, they just lay dormant. So often when people relapse, they report that within days, they are back to the same level of using or drinking that they were before, because of course the amygdala remembers exactly the amount that you had before, and it suggests that amount again. And the danger being that tolerance has plummeted, perhaps, if someone's not been using or drinking for a period of time. And that's when you can have an overdose. And so they're really the two key things that I think are important to know about in early recovery. And like I say, if you want to deep dive into more neuroscience later, absolutely do. But those two parts of the brain, I think, are really the only areas that we need to know about early on: the amygdala and the dopamine reward system, and how they get hijacked and why that then leads to different behavior. And I say that really just to empower people that, you're not mad, you're not a terrible person. This is a chronic learning disorder that has terrible consequences, but the brain is neuroplastic. You've learned this stuff, and guess what? You can unlearn it. If you take a mind altering substance, your mind gets altered. But the brain and the liver, which is great news for probably those people listening to this, are two of the most forgiving organs of the body, and you can make a full recovery, which is absolutely brilliant. I'll do a whole podcast on addiction neuroscientists, science in much more detail very, very soon. But for today, I think that's all we need. Let's get on to life 5. So life 5 actually is the number one cause of relapse. Okay. It's this, and it's the classic, just one won't hurt. It's unbelievable, isn't it? But that is usually what causes relapse. Someone's in recovery, they have this thought, just one won't hurt. They believe it, they get mugged off, they have one, and then they're back in the cycle again. But make no mistake, if you believe just one won't hurt, you've actually gone right back to the beginning. You have definitely gone back to lie 1. Lie 1 being, there is no problem. Because if just one isn't going to hurt you, then guess what? You have no problem. So what is the problem? Well, according to step 1 of AA, NA, and CA, the problem is that you're powerless. So what does that mean? Well, for a lot of people, when they're trying to work out if they're powerless or not, they compare themselves to other people and sort of put themselves on the Premier League table of powerlessness and always manage to find somebody else who's much worse. But the problem with that is it's never got anything to do with the person. And so the question I always come back to is very simple. And here it is. Can I be sure I can stop at 1? And if the answer is it depends or maybe, then I'm definitely powerless. If someone pours me a glass of orange juice and they say to me, can you be sure I can stop at 1? Well, it's easy. It's orange juice. I mean, even if it's something that I really like a coffee, if someone says to me, right, I need you just to have 1 coffee today, well, that's easy because I'm not powerless over coffee. So it's got nothing to do with how much I like something. I mean, I love a roast dinner, but I've never once gone on a roast dinner bender. Do you know what I mean? I've never gone into the pub on a Sunday, had a chicken roast, and then, been bang on the beef, and then I've been on the lamb, and then I'm banging on a door at 3:00 in the morning going, oi, someone roast me something, I'm dying here. You're not going to find me outside Tesco covered in orange rinds going, someone please just give me another orange. I mean, in fact, if that was my behavior, you'd go, wow, Ollie definitely is powerless over oranges. He definitely is powerless over roast dinners. But with alcohol and drugs, the person that's suffering often is in complete denial about it. Go, well, it's not that. So powerlessness doesn't mean that every time you have one, you end up in a skip. It just means you're not quite sure which way it's going to go. So, someone turns around to maybe their husband or wife, and they turn around and say, I'm just going to the pub for a quick one. And often the husband or wife or partner, or whoever it is, looks scared and says, well, what time will you be home? And so they turn around and they say, a couple of hours. But they know that once they have that one drink, that they become powerless over their timekeeping. And then there's kind of a cascade effect because often people who are suffering with addiction will then be powerless over their mood. Now, again, that doesn't mean that every time they go out, they have a terrible time. And just like with the timekeeping, sometimes people come back bang on 2 hours. But again, powerless means I might be back in 2 hours or I might not. I might come back in a good mood or I might not. And the bit that breaks people normally and kind of forces them into recovery is the next day, powerless over my mental health. That's often what breaks people. No control over their anxiety, no control over their depression, no control over their paranoia, and it becomes one consequence too much. Just one won't hurt. Well, it's like the old timers said, it's the first one that does the damage. If you can get your head around that one, this recovery journey is going to become a lot more easier. I really believe, for a lot of people, a relapse is about research. It's about, I don't believe I'm powerless, so I'm going to go and do some research and I'm going to prove everybody wrong. The trouble with that research is that it does kill people and it causes people a lot of problems. Okay, let's get on to lie 6. Lie 6 is, it will be different this time. Well, again, if you believe it's going to be different this time, then you've basically gone back to lie 1 again, which is there is no problem. Because if it will be different this time, then there is no problem. This is the exact same lie again. And it's such a mug off, right? It's like somebody coming around your house, on New Year's Day in a black suit, and they show a card and they say, "Hi, I work for British Gas." So you let them in and they completely rob you. And you're like, "Oh, if I ever see that person again, I'm gonna get them." And then the next day they show up, but this time they're in an orange suit, right? And you think, "Oh, well, it can't be the same person because the person that came yesterday was in a black suit. Come on in." And then they rob you again. It just doesn't make any sense. It is that big a mug off. Okay, let's go to lie 7. Lie 7 is no one is here who will know. Now, addiction doesn't care about intelligence. It doesn't care about class, creed, race, religion, how many diplomas you've got. It really, really doesn't matter. Now, this one really stands out, actually. It was a few years ago. I was working in a rehab and I was working with an amazing GP who had fallen into problems around alcohol use, and she really wanted to get abstinent. And she spent 28 days in rehab, and she was doing incredibly well. And 2 months later, she was back. And I was genuinely shocked. I was like, "What happened?" And she turned around and she said, "My husband went on business." And I thought, well, he's not here, so who's going to know? Now, this is someone who's highly intelligent. Now, that obviously makes no logical sense, but to the person that's suffering from addiction, it seems to penetrate through. But of course, it doesn't make any sense. It's a little bit like that philosophical question. What is it? If a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound if no one hears it? It's kind of that kind of logic. Well, yeah, of course it does. And of course, it's still your body. It's still the drug or the drink going into you. And that powerlessness will then just return and the addiction will get bigger. Okay, let's go on to lie 8. Forever is impossible. So why not just relapse now? You see, most people, when they start a recovery journey, they put their good boy hat on and they turn around to their addiction and they say, "That's it. I'm never going to drink and I'm never going to drug again." And addiction just laughs. It's like, "What? Never? That's ridiculous." And it just laughs. So the old adage of just for today is so important here. I believe it's really, really important to only ever concentrate on the day that you're in, because forever it's just too big a concept for the human brain to manage. I mean, there are some people in recovery that have got that kind of like all or nothing mindset, and it seems to help them. And if that's you, then great. But in my experience, most people don't like the concept of forever. I mean, I often say this to people in rehab, like, imagine outside there was a little helicopter and you could jump in and we'd go off to a desert island and it's absolute paradise, and we step off and it's beautiful. And then people turn around to me and they say, "Well, how long are we here for?" And I say, "We are here forever." Well, most people would panic. That beautiful blue sea would suddenly seem like prison bars. And no one would enjoy their time there. They'd just be freaking out. How on earth am I going to get off this island? Whereas if I'd have turned around to them and said, "We're just here for a couple of days," you'd be, swimming in the sea, you'd be on a hammock, you'd be building a sandcastle. I mean, I know you're not 8 years old, but you get the point. As soon as we put forever into the mix, the brain panics. And the other reason I don't like this lie as well is what you're doing is you're mugging off your future self. Your addiction is imagining a future you that is still addicted to drugs and alcohol. So therefore, in the future, you're really, really still wanting to use and you're still wanting to drink. But what about if the future you doesn't care about drugs? What about if the future you doesn't care about drink? See, addiction doesn't throw that into the mix. If you think about the best version of yourself, now I'm talking to people in recovery, obviously. This whole podcast I am really. It's probably somebody that is completely free of drugs and alcohol. They never really ever think about it, that they're completely neutral around it and they just don't care. Well, addiction tells you a lie and tells you that isn't the future you. So of course that seems really scary. But what about if that was the future you? And that's the mindset that you've got to have. And when that doesn't work, it's just for today. All right, let's go on to lie 9. We're getting there now. So lie 9, that's quite hard to say. Lie 9 is, it will be like the good old days. Sometimes this is called euphoric recall. Obviously, the first time people experience drugs and alcohol, they get a massive rush of dopamine. And for a lot of people, early using and drinking was a happy time, a really, really good time. But I like to look at people's drinking and drug careers a little bit like the movie Scarface, right? So if you're watching the movie Scarface and you get halfway through the film and you pause it, right? You'd probably want to be Tony Montana. I mean, he's like the main guy. He's just bought a tiger. He's married Michelle Pfeiffer. He's got tons of money. But then if you fast forward to the end of the film, he's being shot to death multiple times by gangsters. Nobody wants to be Al Pacino at the end of the movie. Well, isn't that what most people, well, everybody's drinking and drug career is like who are in recovery? Started off great and then it got terrible. So no, it won't be like the good old days. It will actually be like the worst days. And we know, neuroscience tells us that relapses get worse. The damage that is caused by drugs and alcohol does even more damage because the tolerance has gone down. And, that's why people end up in such awful circumstances. In fact, one of the biggest causes of death in people with alcohol abuse problems is accidents. The majority of deaths from alcohol actually come from accidents, people in blackout, falling down flights of stairs, walking into a car, etc. Okay, now let's look at lie 10. This one is really difficult. Lie 10 is, it will make you feel better. A drug or a drink will make you feel better. Now, this is a real tricky one. This is some real gaslighting going on here because potentially there is an element of truth there, particularly in early recovery. I would probably say only in early recovery. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, if you're suffering withdrawal or you're feeling particularly anxious, I suppose that it is possible that for a nanosecond, there could be a moment of relief. However, ultimately, you're going to feel worse. You see, addiction doesn't care about tomorrow. It only cares about now. So if it's Thursday and you're wanting to drink, addiction will say, go on, have a drink. It's Thursday. It's going to be the best night of your life. It's going to be Thursday night for the rest of your life. And then you turn around and say, yeah, but hold on. What about Friday? La, 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 la. Quiet, quiet, quiet. Friday does not exist. Shh, but it does exist. And so many people that relapse, when they come round the next day, they generally confused. Like, actually, I hadn't thought about this bit. Like, I've got to go to work. I've got to get the kids to school. I've still got a life to do. So no, it won't make you feel better because ultimately you're going to feel worse. And that's why people then use again. And so what then happens is they become habitual drinkers. They become daily drinkers. They become, daily drug users. And obviously that is not sustainable. I've worked with people in recovery like, well, I've never had a hangover because I've just carried on. Well, obviously that isn't sustainable. At some point, your body and brain is going to collapse and you're not going to be able to function anymore. And of course, by that point, they can't. So the ultimate truth there is actually, no, it won't make you feel better. It's going to make you worse. And that is real classic gaslighting technique. Like I said, addiction is a liar. And here it's taking something that's slightly like the truth, but actually bending it into something completely different. Here's an analogy that really, really helps me with this one. I remember once, many years ago, I was in the Caribbean and I was having a few beers. And I looked down at my ankles and I'd been bitten to death by a load of sandflies. And I woke up the next day. I've never experienced an itch like it in my life. And these bites were huge. And I thought to myself, I cannot scratch these bites. I cannot. They're so itchy, but I cannot touch them. And my plan was to literally go into the shower, get some cold water on it, take an antihistamine and just get on with my day. But instead I gave in and I really, really, really gave my bites like the biggest scratch I could. And I got to admit, for a second, it felt amazing. It felt absolutely amazing. But then I looked down at my fingernails. Sorry, this is a little bit gross. And not only were they covered in blood, but my bites were now more itchy and I was in pain. Isn't that a little bit what a relapse is like? You may get a moment of relief, but then immediately you're in more pain. And guess what? The craving hasn't gone away, it's amplified. So it's a completely pointless endeavor. I mean, once in a while, I'll fancy something really unhealthy to eat. I'll admit it, like, like some fried chicken or something. Um, but once I eat the fried chicken, once I'm done, I'm like, that's it. I'm done. I'm not, now I'm not craving more fried chicken. But people who are in recovery, that isn't the mechanism. That isn't what happens. The craving just amplifies and you're in more pain. And, it's always the next one. Oh, yeah, I'll stop after the next one, the next one, the next one. And you can never get out of that loop. So, no, it doesn't make you feel better. It absolutely 100% makes it worse. Okay, this now takes me to lie 11, which is if only you were normal. Well, what is normal? Well, what addiction likes to do is it likes to suggest very firmly that if you could drink normally or even use drugs recreationally, that your life would be perfect. But this is a nonsense. Most people that are in recovery have actually got no desire at all to drink normally or to use normally. What they usually want to do is to get drunk or use as much as they can. And I actually think it's another part of the denial. And I actually know people that I've worked with in rehabs who have actually relapsed on half a lager. They've had like 4 months off the booze. They've gone into a nice pub. They've ordered half a lager. They've brought a broadsheet newspaper. They've sat in the garden, and 3 weeks later, they're in an alleyway, collapsed. All because they'd bought into the lie that they just wanted half a lager. That's not really true. And the analogy I would use there, and I'm talking to somebody now who's in recovery, who's really struggling with this. I want you to imagine that the fairy godmother shows up in your flat and turns around to you and says, you've got one wish. And you turn around and say, I wish I could drink normally. Let's use that as the wish. And then the fairy godmother turns around and says, are you sure? And you say, well, yeah, obviously, that would be great. She goes, okay, my wish is your command. Ding. And now suddenly you can drink normally. So that person then goes down the pub and they order a pint of beer and they think, well, this is all right. Yeah, I can drink normally. This feels okay. They get to the second pint and they're about 4/5 of the way down the pint. And suddenly there's a little tap on the shoulder. And they turn around and there's the world's strongest man. And he turns around to me and goes, who are you? And he says, oh, I'm the world's strongest man. What are you doing here? Oh, didn't I tell you I work for the fairy godmother, and you've just had the NHS guidelines because you're drinking quite strong lager. What do you mean? Well, you said you wanted to be a normal drinker. I'm afraid that's your lot. Oh, that's rubbish. Oh, hold on a minute. Did you say you wanted to be a recreational drug user as well? Yeah, sure. All right. Well, the fairy godmother doesn't know the NHS guidelines for cocaine, so I've just made you a little wrap there. There you go. So that person then goes off into the toilet and they get the wrap out and they're banging the top and they can barely get a little line of cocaine out of it. Anyway, they decide to snort it. So they're feeling a little bit more awake. They go back to the bar, turn around to the barman and say, I want another beer. And the guy turns around and says, oi, I told you we had a deal. You're not allowed any more today. So the guy gets a little bit shirty, starts having a bit of a row with him. So the world's strongest man, he grabs him, he marches him out of the pub and he says, right, you go home and no messing about. So anyway, he goes into the bush and he starts watching this guy and he can see that he's starting to veer off towards the off license. So he runs after him, he grabs him, he puts him in the back of the van, he drives him to the Ritz Hotel, he puts him in the penthouse suite because the fairy godmother's very nice. He checks in, he goes into the room, he goes straight for the minibar. There's nothing there. There's an orange juice, there's a Twix, there's a Ribena, and there's a little note from the fairy godmother. Sorry, you're not allowed any more booze today. Frustrated, it calls room service. It orders a pizza and a bottle of the wine. And the guy on the phone says, I'm sorry, sir, but the fairy godmother has been on the phone. You're not allowed any more today. The point is that person is not going to get into bed happy. They're not going to be satisfied and warm and go, oh, I had a pint and a half and I feel all content and now I'm going to go to sleep. The truth of the matter is that person is going to be checking the watch, waiting for it to be the next day, already obsessing about when that next drink can come. So this idea that normal is going to solve the problem is really a fallacy. I mean, my wife on New Year's Eve, she has a glass of champagne. She might have a second glass of champagne, and then she stops drinking. And I ask her, "Why are you not having another one?" She goes, "Oh, because I'm starting to feel a bit buzzed. I'm starting to feel a bit tipsy." She doesn't like that bit. Another mistake that often people in recovery make is they assume that people that drink recreationally or even use drugs recreationally are getting the exact same buzz that they used to when they first started using and drinking. And we know it's simply not true. I've done a lot of extensive research on this. And there's lots of reasons why this can happen. There's been a lot of research in the basal ganglia part of the brain, which I like to call the woohoo part of the brain. That's the part of the brain that processes dopamine. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that people that end up with a substance misuse problem simply process dopamine in a different type of way. And one analogy I would use for that is, if you're playing a game with fiber optic broadband at high speed, you're going to get a very different experience to somebody that's in the middle of a forest on a 2G network that's barely working. So I think sometimes the way that people experience drugs and alcohol who end up with a substance misuse problem, you know, it's completely on a different level to what other people may experience. I mean, I've asked friends about this. I've got a friend who has a couple of beers a week, and I've said to him, what happens in your brain when you have a beer? And he looks genuinely confused. He's like, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, what does it feel like?" He said, "Oh, a bit like having a cup of tea." I said, "Oh, come on, don't lie." He said, "Okay, it's a bit like a cup of tea with a bit of cake." Okay, well, that makes sense. That's why you can have two and leave it. But often with people suffering with alcoholism or a substance misuse problem, you know, particularly early on, they could feel an intense euphoria, like even having a beer at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. They're ready to go clubbing. They're ready to, go on a trip. Whereas other people will just have a beer and then just sort of waddle off home and have a cup of tea and do some work. So I think assuming that other people are experiencing what you used to experience, again, is not true. So this idea again that you want to be normal, I would really question that, and I would really try and smash that to bits if you can. This now brings me on to lie 12, which is in some ways one of the saddest ones. And that is quite simply that you aren't enough. On some level, someone suffering with addiction believes that they need drugs and alcohol not only to survive life, but also just to be enough, to be funny enough, to be sexy enough, to be clever enough, to be anything enough. And that simply is not true. And that's one of the things I love most about recovery is seeing people's confidence go sky high. Because you see, going back to the amygdala again, that part of the brain, along with the dopamine reward system that believes you need alcohol or drugs to survive, it thinks you're making a terrible mistake not drinking and not drugging. And that's where all these thoughts are coming from. It's desperately trying to keep you alive, trying to persuade you to go back to the drugs and the drink. But every single day that you don't pick up and you don't use, that learning disorder is being rectified. And your brain is learning that actually, yes, you can do life without a drug or a drink. You are enough. You can dance on the dance floor. You can start that business. You can travel the world. You can get on that stage. You can win that award. You can do everything, and you do not need drugs and alcohol to achieve it. And that is one of the most beautiful things about recovery. Not only are you going to be completely free of the drug or the drink that has had you in its chains and in its grasp, but you are going to believe wholeheartedly that you are enough and that you don't need anything except maybe a cup of tea and a bit of cake to conquer life. Unfortunately, there are more lies attached to addiction. And on another podcast, I will most definitely cover those. I could sit here all day talking about the lies of addiction. I find it absolutely fascinating. But I think, understanding that it comes from a part of the brain that's really desperately trying to keep you alive, I think that really helps me understand, where these intrusive thoughts come from. And like I say, every day that you're not drinking or drugging, those intrusive thoughts calm down to the point where they completely almost disappear. I never really get any of these 12 lies, hardly ever at all. If I do, it might be once a year, and it's such a fleeting thought. And my relationship to that thought is so different now. Like before, it would be like, why am I thinking that? This is really bad. I shouldn't be thinking that. And now I'm like, oh, yeah, I would think that. That makes sense. Like if I played tennis all my life and then I retired, sometimes I'd think about tennis. It's a similar analogy that I would use, when people worry about drinking or using dreams. It doesn't necessarily have to mean anything. It's usually a good thing because it's the brain sort of warning you not to go back there. Um, so yeah, there are more lies attached, and I will definitely talk about that in another podcast. But I just want to thank all of you for joining me for the last bit. I don't know how long how long I've been gabbing on, but for anybody that is listening to this who's early recovery, I hope that has been helpful. Um, when the thoughts come in, don't panic. Share it. Get on the phone. I'm hoping that maybe you've got a sponsor, or you've got a home group, or you've got a therapist, or you've got a smart recovery group, or some other recovery community that you can share these thoughts with. Don't be ashamed about them. Air them. We're only as sick as our secrets, they say. So make sure that you're sharing them. And by doing that, you'll take the power out of them. And, don't sit in these thoughts. Take action. Do something, call someone else in recovery, help somebody else, get to a meeting, go and talk to a therapist, go for a walk, as long as it's not going near the off license or where the old dealer used to be. And like they say, this too shall pass. As you can see, I'm finding it very hard to wrap this up because there's so much more I want to say, but I'll leave it for another time. But I just want to thank everyone for supporting this podcast. And also, I want to wish you a really happy Christmas and New Year. I've got some amazing guests lined up. In fact, I've already got 4 in the can ready to go. And as always, and as I always promise, I will see you in 2 weeks' time. Take care of yourself. Thank you.